The wine glass shattered against the marble floor, and the sound cut through the dining room like a gunshot. Grace froze, her hand still trembling from where the glass had slipped. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Margaret Okoro's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Careful, dear," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We wouldn't want you breaking anything else tonight." Daniel rushed to Grace's side, kneeling to help her pick up the shards. "It's fine, Mom. It's just a glass." "Of course it's just a glass," Margaret replied, raising her own glass to her lips. "But some things, once broken, can never be put back together. Don't you agree, Grace?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace forced herself to breathe, to steady her hands, to remember why she had agreed to this dinner in the first place. Because she loved Daniel. Because she had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that love would be enough to soften a mother's heart. She should have known better. 3 hours earlier, everything had felt different. Daniel had held her hand in the car, squeezing it gently as they pulled into the long driveway of his family estate. "She's going to love you," he had said, smiling that smile that made Grace forget every doubt she carried. "Just be yourself. Be yourself." As if that had ever been the problem. The dinner began pleasantly enough. Margaret asked about Grace's work as a school principal, nodded approvingly at her answers about discipline and academic excellence, even complimented her dress. For a moment, Grace allowed herself to hope. Then came the question that changed everything. "So, Grace," Margaret said, setting down her fork with deliberate precision, "how old are you exactly?" The table went quiet. Daniel's hand found Grace's beneath the tablecloth. "I'm 42, Grace answered, lifting her chin. She had nothing to hide. She had built a life she was proud of. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. She let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that held no humor at all. 42, she repeated, as though the number itself were an insult. "Daniel, you didn't tell me she was old enough to be your—" She stopped herself, pressing a manicured hand to her chest in mock distress. "Forgive me. I just need a moment." "Mom," Daniel said firmly, "that's enough." "No, it is not enough." Margaret's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "I have spent my entire life building this family's name, our reputation, our standing in this community. And now you bring home a woman 11 years older than you, with no husband, no children of her own, and you expect me to simply smile and accept her. She's not a woman, Mother. Her name is Grace. And I love her." "Love." Margaret spat the word like it tasted bitter. "You don't know the first thing about love, Daniel. You know infatuation. You know rebellion. This," she gestured at Grace with a dismissive wave, "this is you trying to prove something to me." Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "Mrs. Okoro, I never asked Daniel to choose me over his family. I only ever wanted to be given a chance." "A chance?" Margaret turned on her, eyes blazing. "Let me guess. You're tired of being alone, aren't you? 42 years old, no husband, no children, and suddenly my son walks into your life with his money and his future, and you saw your chance to finally have what you never built for yourself." The accusation struck like a physical blow. Grace's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You're too old for my son," Margaret declared, loud enough for every guest at the table to hear. "And no amount of pretending will change that truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. Grace rose slowly from her chair, her dignity the only thing holding her together. "Excuse me," she whispered, and walked out before her tears could betray her further. Daniel found her on the veranda minutes later, the cool night air doing little to calm the storm inside her. "Grace, please, don't listen to her. She doesn't understand. She understands exactly what she wants to understand, Daniel." Grace turned to face him, tears finally spilling freely. "And maybe she's not entirely wrong. Maybe I am too old. Maybe I should have known better than to let myself fall for you." "Don't say that." Daniel reached for her hands. "I don't care what she thinks. I love you, Grace. Age was never the issue for me. But it's the issue for her," Grace said softly. "And she's your mother, Daniel. I can't be the reason you lose her. I won't be. You're not going to lose me over this." "I'm not talking about you," Grace whispered. "I'm talking about me." I refuse to spend the rest of my life being a wedge between you and your family. I've spent too many years sacrificing for the people I love to become someone's burden now. Grace. Goodbye, Daniel. She walked away that night and didn't look back, even as she heard him calling her name into the darkness, even as her heart shattered with every step she took toward her car. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of Daniel's life. He called. He texted. He showed up at her school twice, only to be gently but firmly turned away by security at Grace's request. Margaret, for her part, seemed triumphant, humming to herself around the house as though she had won some great victory. "You'll thank me one day," she told Daniel over breakfast one morning. "When you find a proper wife, someone your own age, someone who can give this family grandchildren and a future worth being proud of, you'll understand I was protecting you." Daniel said nothing. He simply pushed his food around his plate and excused himself. He buried himself in his work at the hospital, taking double shifts, volunteering for surgeries no one else wanted. Anything to keep his mind from drifting back to the sound of Grace's voice breaking as she said goodbye. Grace, meanwhile, returned to her own life with the quiet resilience that had carried her through every hardship before. She threw herself back into her school, mentoring students who reminded her so much of her own siblings years ago, children who needed someone to believe in them when no one else would. 4 months passed this way. Then, without warning, everything changed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel received the call while reviewing patient charts at the hospital. His sister's voice was frantic on the other end. "Daniel, it's Mom." She collapsed. "You need to come now." He arrived at the emergency room within minutes, his medical training the only thing keeping him from falling apart as he watched his mother's unconscious body wheeled past him on a gurney. The diagnosis came hours later, delivered by a colleague whose face told Daniel everything before the words even left his mouth. "Severe liver failure, Daniel. She needs a transplant, and she needs one soon." The following days blurred into a desperate search for a compatible donor. Family members were tested one by one, aunts, uncles, cousins, even distant relatives flown in from abroad. None of them matched. Margaret's condition worsened with each passing day, her once proud frame growing frail and yellow beneath hospital sheets. "Am I going to die?" Margaret asked Daniel one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, stripped of all the arrogance that had once defined her. "No," Daniel said, gripping her hand tightly. "We're going to find someone. I promise." But privately, he feared he was lying to her. Then, on the 11th day, a miracle arrived. The hospital informed the family that a compatible donor had come forward, someone who had voluntarily undergone testing weeks earlier and requested complete anonymity. The transplant was scheduled immediately. The surgery was a success. Margaret's body slowly began to heal, color returning to her cheeks, strength returning to her limbs. She repeatedly asked the hospital staff who had saved her life, desperate to thank the stranger who had given her a second chance. Hospital policy, however, remained firm. The donor's identity would stay confidential unless they chose to reveal it themselves. Margaret assumed it had to be a distant relative, someone too humble to step forward for recognition. She told herself this story so many times that she nearly believed it. But Daniel noticed something strange in the weeks that followed. Late at night, when the hospital halls were quiet, he saw a figure lingering near his mother's room, never entering, simply watching from a distance before disappearing into the elevator. The figure's silhouette struck something deep and familiar in him, though the dim lighting made it impossible to be certain. He didn't have to wonder for long. 3 weeks after Margaret's discharge, a sealed envelope arrived at the family estate, addressed simply to Margaret O'Caro. Inside was a single handwritten letter, the penmanship elegant and careful. Margaret's hands shook as she read the words aloud to herself in the privacy of her study. "Dear Margaret, by now you may have guessed, or perhaps you haven't. I was the donor. When I learned through a mutual friend that you needed a transplant and that no family member was compatible, I volunteered for testing without hesitation. I am not writing this for gratitude, and I ask that you never tell Daniel I expected any recognition for what I did. I did it because I couldn't bear the thought of him losing his mother, regardless of how you and I have struggled to understand one another. You may never accept me as the woman who loves your son, and I have made peace with that possibility. But I could not stand by and do nothing while his heart broke at the thought of losing you. With sincerity, Grace. The letter slipped from Margaret's fingers, fluttering to the floor as she sank into her chair, overwhelmed by an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Shame. Pure, undiluted shame. For the first time in decades, Margaret Okoro wept. The following morning, driven by something she couldn't quite name, Margaret began searching for answers about the woman she had so thoroughly condemned. What she uncovered shattered every assumption she had clung to. Grace had not spent her younger years selfishly pursuing career and independence, as Margaret had assumed. She had spent them raising her 3 younger siblings after both of their parents died in a car accident when Grace was only 23. She had abandoned her own dreams of marriage and family, working multiple jobs while putting herself through school at night, ensuring her siblings never went without food, education, or love. Today, one sibling worked as a nurse in a regional hospital. Another had become a respected engineer. The youngest, the one Grace had practically raised as her own child, was now a successful lawyer in the capital. Grace had sacrificed nearly 2 decades of her own life so that her family could have a future. The years Margaret had mocked, the years she had called too old, too late, too undesirable, those had been years of quiet, relentless sacrifice. Margaret sat in stunned silence as the full weight of her cruelty settled over her. Grace wasn't too old for her son. She had simply spent her youth saving her family, exactly as any mother would want a daughter to do. That afternoon, without telling anyone where she was going, Margaret had her driver take her to Grace's school. She found her exactly where she expected, in an empty classroom after hours, sitting among a small group of students, helping them sound out difficult words from a worn textbook. Grace looked up when the door opened, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion as Margaret stepped inside. "Mrs. Okoro? Is everything all right?" Margaret didn't answer with words. Instead, in front of startled students and a teacher who had frozen mid-sentence, she lowered herself to her knees on the classroom floor. "Mrs. Okoro, please," Grace rushed forward, alarmed. "What are you doing?" "I am asking your forgiveness," Margaret said, her voice cracking, tears streaming freely down her face. "I judged you by a number, by years I knew nothing about. I called you too old when you had spent your youth being everything a mother should be to children who weren't even your own. I was wrong, Grace. I was cruel, and I was wrong." Grace knelt beside her, gently helping the older woman to her feet, her own eyes filling with tears despite herself. "You didn't know." "I didn't want to know," Margaret admitted. "It was easier to judge you than to see you." The classroom door opened again, and Daniel stepped inside, having rushed from the hospital the moment he learned where his mother had gone. He stopped short at the sight before him, his mother and the woman he loved, standing together, both in tears. "Mom?" Margaret turned to her son, taking both his hands in hers. "I spent my whole life searching for the perfect wife for you, Daniel. And I nearly chased away the best woman you will ever meet." Daniel's throat tightened as he looked between the 2 women who meant everything to him. Without another word, he pulled them both into his arms, holding them close as the classroom around them fell into a stunned, tearful silence. 6 months later, the small chapel overflowed with flowers and soft afternoon light. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes never leaving Grace as she walked toward him in a simple ivory gown, radiant and unburdened for the first time in years. Margaret walked beside her, not as a mother-in-law fulfilling obligation, but as a woman who had finally learned what truly mattered. She placed Grace's hand in Daniel's with a gentle smile, whispering words meant only for her. "Welcome to our family, my daughter." As Daniel and Grace exchanged their vows, Margaret watched from the front row, tears of joy replacing the tears of shame she had carried for months. She finally understood what she had nearly destroyed out of pride and prejudice. Some people grow older not because life was kind to them, but because they spent their youth carrying burdens others never had to bear. The years Margaret had once judged so harshly had not made Grace too old for her son. They had made her exactly the woman he needed.